Hey guys, my name is Christine, what is up? So many of you probably know me from my Twitch channel, where I typically speedrun games from the original 8-bit NES. So I love the NES, I grew up with that console, and as a kid that was bullied a lot and didn't have any friends growing up, the NES was a huge part of my childhood. But you might not know that the NES was not actually my first home console. So when I was a little kid, a lot of the kids in my neighborhood and in my family had the Atari 2600, which is kind of regarded as one of the first hugely successful home consoles. But strangely enough, even though I was an Atari kid, I've never owned a 2600. Even today, as a grown-ass adult who owns over 20 gaming consoles, I do not own a 2600. Also a Master System. I've never owned a Master System, although I've always wanted to. But no, when I was a kid, we had the less popular but far superior Atari 5200. So the 5200 gets a lot of flack from the retro gaming community as being a weird, awkward system where the console is as big as a VCR and the controller is this weird thing. But you know what? I loved my 5200. Some of my earliest memories are of me as a little kid playing my 5200 on our huge furniture cabinet style CRT. You know, the kind that makes that loud kerchunk sound when you turn it on. Like, I would literally wake up in the middle of the night, sneak into the living room, and try to play Atari really quietly so as to not wake anybody up. Like, I don't know about you guys, but sitting in a dark room playing Atari on a bright, overly convex CRT screen was like peak early 80s. My dad sold our 5200 when we got our NES, and boy was I upset about that at the time. But I managed to reacquire a 5200 in a small library of games back in the early 2000s on eBay. Yeah, remember eBay? When's the last time you bought something on eBay? But anyways, today I thought it would be cool to go through all of my 5200 games and rank them. I think every game I owned as a kid is in this stack, plus a few others, so it should be fun to go back and revisit these guys. So I'll be using the standard S through F tier system for this, and of course this is going to be relative to the state of home video games during the early 80s, so when I list one of these games as S tier, that doesn't mean I'm saying it's as good as like Fortnite or Call of Duty or whatever. Like, I'm not going to sit here and try to compare Missile Command to Red Dead Redemption, that'd be ridiculous. Like, I feel like that should be pretty obvious, but I also kind of feel like it needed to be said. First off, the 5200 itself is actually a pretty decent console for 1982. It had the unfortunate circumstance of being sandwiched right between the 1977 release of the highly successful 2600 and the video game crash of 1983. I think at the time we didn't really have a great example of what a good release cadence is for home video game systems, so a company introducing a whole new upgraded game console as a successor to a previous console was kind of uncharted waters at the time, both for the company releasing the console and the families buying them up. I feel like it wasn't really until the release of the Super Nintendo or even the N64 that we kind of accepted the fact that advancements in gaming is going to necessitate consoles with better hardware. But back in the early 80s, it made sense for parents to look at a brand new Atari console and go, why? We have Atari at home. And then this is Atari at home. So I think most Atari enthusiasts will agree that the Achilles heel of the 5200 is probably this freaking thing. So this is a standard controller for an Atari 5200, and it's often regarded as one of the worst controller designs ever for a major console. I understand that take, and I don't disagree with it. I do have an emotional connection to this thing, but I do feel like it's a lot more complicated than it needs to be for how poorly designed the actual components are and how it's ultimately put together. It's kind of a shame, because this controller is actually the successor to this, which is one of the most iconic controllers in the history of gaming. This controller is a lot more advanced than the one for the 2600. For one, the analog stick has full 360-degree motion, supposedly, as opposed to the 2600, which only really has 4 contacts supporting 8 potential directions. It also has this little keypad that you can use to set up some options for the games that you're playing. Some of the games came with these little overlays that would actually go into the controller so you'd know what these buttons are programmed to do. So the controller itself was pretty ambitious for its time. It kind of fell short because the parts used to assemble this controller are just pretty cheap. I only have the one working controller, and whenever I fire up the console, there's a lot of uncertainty that this controller will actually work. Nowadays, you can go online and find all sorts of aftermarket replacement buttons and parts and whatnot, which is good because as a 42-year-old system, it's just difficult to find good OEM parts, and working 5200 controllers can run you a few bucks. Actually, when I was making this video, I had to go online and find an aftermarket flex circuit for this one. Also, the stick doesn't have a good centering mechanism other than it's sitting in this little rubber boot that sort of forces the stick back into position, which just isn't too reliable. Anyways, enough about the controller, let's get into these games. So the first one we're going to take a look at is Centipede. So this is a pretty iconic arcade title from the early 80s. You know how it goes. You control this little thing, shooting up at centipedes, it's making its way down the screen, going back and forth. In the process, you're fighting off spiders and fleas and whatever the hell this thing is. It's a pretty cool little game. I played this one a lot as a kid. Most people are probably going to be more familiar with its successor, Millipede, which came out 1 year after Centipede in the arcades. I actually played Millipede on the NES in a Big 20 speedrun competition last year. Millipede did get a 2600 release, but for some reason never seemed to make it over to the 5200. When you look at Centipede on the 5200, your first thought might be how inferior it looks. So when I fired this up recently for the first time in probably several decades, I was a little underwhelmed after playing so much Millipede for that Big 20. But when you compare it to the actual arcade release of Centipede, you see it's actually not a bad little port. And I think when you compare it to the 2600 version, you kind of get your first glimpse into the way in which the 5200 really made some huge leaps in terms of actually being able to replicate more of the look and feel of arcade games versus these primitive blocky sprites that basically leave a lot to the imagination. But I like Centipede. I'm going to go ahead and give this one a B. It's a great port and a classic fun game, but considering what's to come on this list, I think a B is a reasonable grade. One other thing I want to point out about this console while I'm holding this cartridge is that the 5200 really nailed it in terms of box art. Like, look at this image. This is a great cartridge label for a home Atari port of an 80s arcade game. Like, that's just really cool. Next up, one of everybody's favorites, Pac-Man. So this specific port of this specific game is often cited by me as one of the first video games I ever remember playing. A lot of you know the Atari 2600 got a pretty infamous port of Pac-Man back in 1982 that just isn't very true to form, to say the least. The 5200 port is not perfect, but it is pretty representative of the original arcade classic for the most part. It does have the same maps, although they are stretched horizontally, I guess to compensate for the fact that most people will be playing this on a horizontal CRT instead of an arcade machine where the screens are upright. There are some nitpicky things you can kind of point to. For instance, Inky is green instead of blue for some reason. Originally I thought this might be a limitation of the color palette, not wanting to confuse ghosts in each of their stages, but there appears to be a lot of different shades of blue. The ghost sprites themselves have been downgraded, and if you want to get really petty, you can point to the fact that the dot patterns aren't exactly the same. Also, I don't think the ghost AI is the same as it is in the arcade, which might not matter to most casual players, but again, it's a lot better than what we got on the 2600, that's for sure. I'm gonna go ahead and give this one an A in all honesty. It's a cool port, Pac-Man's a classic, I'm giving it an A. Alright, let's move on to pole position. So 5200 pole position is probably the first racing game I ever played. A lot of you guys know that nowadays I like to do iRacing, which is not a game, but a racing simulator. Let me in here. Suffice it to say, we've come a long way in the past 42 years as far as racing games are concerned. Pole Position is an F1 arcade game released in 1982 by Namco. It takes place on, or should I say is loosely based on, the real-life Fuji Speedway in Shizuoka, Japan. The 5200 version, however, actually contains 4 tracks: Practice Run, Namco Speedway, Malibu Grand Prix, and Atari Grand Prix. When I was a kid, I didn't really pay much attention to the layouts of the tracks. I just drove the car and turned when a turn came up. So I was probably pretty reactionary to the flow of the game and didn't really study racing lines or anything like that. Revisiting this game in preparation for this video, I actually tried learning more about the actual tracks. I started on Malibu, which is selected by default. I found you can pretty much just run wide open and turn when the game turns, with the exception of one left-hander where you will have to let off in order to not push into the billboards. I went and tried another track and found it was suspiciously similar to Malibu. After doing a little research, I found that the only real difference between the tracks is the number of billboards and cars. So really the game only has one track, just recycled 4 times. Not only that, but the track in this game is the exact same layout as Fuji, so basically this game just has Fuji Speedway. I'm not sure why they don't call it that, maybe some copyright thing. Anyway, so the first step is qualifying. When you drive, you start off in low gear, then you want to switch to high gear when your speed hits about 100. I think this game is where I really started to have issues with the 5200's controller design, because this game hurts your hands. Like, I don't remember that being a thing when I was a kid. Maybe I just had younger, smaller hands back then, but now this is just an awkward way to hold a controller. It might be the way I'm holding the throttle button down with my thumb, but I kind of felt that holding it like this sort of helped for this game, because really once you switch to high gear, you only really care about the throttle left and right. There is some nuance in how you drive. You lose speed if you hit rumble strips or if you turn too sharp and scrub your tires, which is kind of realistic. So really you want to hug the inside of each corner as close as you can with these little steering motions. But it's tough to not hit the rumble strips because you don't really have that precise steering wheel mechanic like the arcade, you just have this weird stick that doesn't center properly. So once you qualify, you grid up for the final race. Honestly, the real goal of the final race is to just survive. You're unrealistically faster than every other car on the track. There are way more than 8 cars because you're gonna start lapping guys by turn 1, and they're all over the track. They change lanes unexpectedly because racing lines just aren't a thing in this game, they get in your way. By default, races are 4 laps, but you can set it to be as high as 8 laps. You have a default time limit of 75 seconds, and each time you pass the start-finish line, you get time awarded to complete the next lap. Once you run out of time, it's game over. The arcade version of this game had actual advertisements on the billboard like Pepsi and Marlboro. Yeah, Marlboro advertised in a video game, if you can believe that. The 5200 version just has plain billboards. I'm not necessarily penalizing this port because of blank billboards, I just found it kinda interesting. I'm gonna give this game an A. Honestly, this game has really good replay value. I actually spent a decent amount of time trying to finish this race. I even loaded up the practice run, which is basically just you out there by yourself to see how fast of a hot lap I could get, and I managed to get down to 56.5, which I don't know if that's good or not. Alright, let's move on from my sport to my brother's sport, soccer. So I never had this game as a kid, and honestly I had never played it before preparing for this video. I actually have a few in the stack that I'm just playing for the first time. Now, I'm not too familiar with soccer games, like I know they have FIFA and all that, and I'm sure they're just fantastic, but you know, one of my favorite soccer games is Goal on the NES. Like, I don't know what it is about that game. Maybe it's the music or the gameplay or this weird bird's eye pseudo-isometric view, but I loved it. I actually learned that Argentina is a country from this game. To this day, whenever I hear someone mention Argentina, I hear this sound in my head. Now, rewind 5 years prior, and this is what we get on the 5200. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's not too horrible. You have more than a reasonable side-scroll 3D view to control your little frog people. Top button shoots, bottom button passes. One weird thing is that the 5 key on your number pad changes your character when you don't have the ball, which kind of makes it awkward to hold the controller. I do actually have the insert that goes into the controller. Apparently these 3 buttons control your kick velocity, all of these change your character, and this is a ground kick, and these 2 change options in the title screen. I couldn't get any of that to work, so I just used the orange buttons to pass and shoot. Honestly, I've never understood why games like this need to be this complicated. One thing that makes games like Goal so much more fun is that in Goal you just have 2 buttons, pass and shoot. The game dictates how strong those actions need to be based on context. Putting that burden on me through this complicated button setup, as if this needs to be some kind of complicated soccer simulator, is just too much. This crude ass game is not worth all this effort. So yeah, I don't know about this one. I think I'm gonna give this one a D, in all honesty. I just couldn't really get into it. So next on the list is Star Raiders, and I'll admit this is another one that I had never played before making this video. So this is kind of a space war simulator type thing that was released in 1980, and as with all video games like this from this period, I use the word simulator very loosely. The basic premise is that you move through this grid of sectors and then fight the spaceships that appear there, and as with any early video game trying to be a simulator, it's just 20 pounds of crap in a 10-pound bag. Like, it just feels like it's trying to be way too big for its britches. I mean, the game itself is a cool premise, there's a lot going on here, and for its time, this level of complexity is pretty cool to see. But I mean, there are 19 buttons and a stick on this controller. You'd think that would be enough. But while every single button on the numbered pad does a thing, one of those buttons acts as kind of a shift so that every single button does this other thing. You use these numbers to go from this top-down view to that top-down view, back to flying mode, but there's also an aft mode so you can see what's behind you. But you're flying through space and your speed is controlled by the numbers, but there's also another set of actions, so you need to do hyperspeed to get from sector to sector, then you find a ship, you have to go quickly back into flying mode, then get into combat mode. You're trying to fly around and fight these things, but it's just overly complicated and to me doesn't really execute too well in my opinion. I'll admit I didn't play it a lot in preparation for this video because there's a whole stack of stuff to get through. So maybe this is just ignorance talking, but it's like somebody had a really cool concept for a video game. They got into the weeds on it and started realizing the limitations of the parameters they're working with and started making concessions to the point where it's nowhere near as good as they intended. So I don't know, I do feel like it's kind of unfair for me to judge because I feel like I would honestly need weeks to get good at this and to appreciate it the way I'm supposed to. I didn't really have this one when I was a kid, so I don't have that nostalgia factor, but I don't know. I'll put it in the D column. Like, you guys have every right to disagree, and I'm sure you will, but this is all subjective and meaningless anyway, so... Okay, so next up in the stack we have Super Breakout, and let me be straight up with you guys, this game is freaking fun. I had this one as a kid, and I loved Super Breakout growing up. It was honestly one of my favorites. So Breakout was a pretty standard brick and ball game that was released in 1976. The concept is pretty simple. You hit ball with stick, ball hit brick, ball come back. If you fail to hit the ball back to the bricks, you lose that ball, run out of balls, game over. Super Breakout was a follow-up that came out in 1978, and let me tell you, the 5200 port was an absolute gem. Along with the standard Breakout you saw in the original game, Super Breakout adds 3 additional modes: Progressive, Double, and Cavity. Progressive is basically 2 rows of bricks to gradually inch closer to your paddle. The further down the bricks are, the harder they are to hit and the less points they give off. Double is essentially standard Breakout but with 2 balls, and Cavity has this little cavities with trap balls in them that you can release and then use. Also, the Double and the Cavity modes give you a double-decker paddle instead of just the one. Clearing a board in this game is a lot easier said than done. When you hit bricks closer to the top, the ball speeds up, and when you hit the very top of the board, your paddle shrinks, making the ball extremely hard to hit. Eventually you get to a point where not hitting the top of the stage is basically impossible, and that's really when the stage becomes incredibly difficult to finish. One of my favorite things to do in this game as a kid was to get the ball into the little top and watch it bounce around, go do 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 do. There you go, get up there. Don't come back down here, thank you. To that right, I think my favorite mode is Progressive because it doesn't take that long to get the ball into the gap. And since there are a second row of bricks, the game doesn't punish you by shrinking your little stick paddle thing. Fast forwarding 40 some odd years, one of my favorite mobile games is this game Bricks Breaker Quest. It's one of those games where you strategically shoot the little balls up into a field of bricks, and after every turn the bricks come down a row. You have to clear the entire board, not letting any of the bricks reach the bottom. I've been playing this game off and on for about 7 years and have completed around 820 levels. These games are a dime a dozen, and without a doubt one of my favorite things about them is getting the balls into the little gaps in the board and then watching the balls bounce around like they did in the old Breakout games. I've always really been into these types of games. So back when I was a kid, my dad and I used to go watch NASCAR races at this little dive bar in Virginia, and I remember they had an Arkanoid cabinet, and I wasted so many of my dad's quarters playing Arkanoid. Arkanoid also got a really cool NES port, and it had one of those controllers with a little knob that you can turn just like the arcade cabinet. That being said, this is one of my favorite games of all time. It has such a big ongoing influence and taste in my games over the years, so I've got to put this one in the S tier. It's such a basic game, but it's just so good and means that much to me. S tier all the way. Alright, next up we have Galaxian. Oh, Galaxian. Galaga's ugly uncle. So yeah, we all know Galaga. It's one of the most, if not the most, iconic Atari games out there. I mean, when you think Atari, you probably think Miss Pac-Man or Galaga. They have huge, ridiculous modern arcade ports of Galaga, Dave & Buster's. It's a pretty classic, well-known fixed space shooter. But before Galaga, we had Galaxian, and let me tell you what, I love Galaxian. Sure, you can only shoot one missile at a time, the bugs don't enter the screen in that cool fly-in way where you can clear out a lot of the stage before it even starts, and it doesn't have that cool iconic feature where your ship is stolen so you can reclaim it later for the double shot. Galaxian is crude, but you know what, it's one of the greats in my book. Galaxian walked so that Galaga could run. The port itself is kinda weird. I mean, it looks good, it serves its purpose, but the ship does look a little different. Some of the sounds are kind of weird. It doesn't look like there are any special modes or anything other than the 2-player mode, so really it kind of serves its purpose in a very basic sort of way. I had a lot of fun playing this one in preparation for this video too. I'm pretty sure I'm way better than I was when I was a kid, so every time you beat a level, you get a little red flag in the HUD. Once that space is full of red flags, every stage you beat makes one of them flash. Once you get them all flashing, the game goes absolutely bonkers. Like, it gets pretty impossible to beat after that. So I don't think the 5200 ever really got a Galaga port, so Galaxian really is the closest you're gonna get on the console to that classic fixed shooter Galaga style game. I would say Galaxian is pretty much a staple for the 5200, but it's Galaxian. I'll give it a B. B for basic ass Atari game. Alright, let's move on to Joust.
Joust.
So Joust is another one I never had as a kid, but I've played a good amount of Joust on other ports. I'm probably most familiar with the port on the NES because we had to play that one for another Big 20 a while back, where the goal was to score 100,000 points as quickly as possible. So I'm pretty familiar with the mechanics and remember some of the strategies I used for that. So in this game you control a knight with a lance on these big birds. Apparently player 1 is mounted on an ostrich and player 2 is on a stork, and you basically joust against the other birds in the stage. When two birds collide, whichever is higher on the vertical axis wins the battle. Birds are killed, they drop these eggs, the eggs hatch and release other birds if you don't collect them fast enough.
Come on, that's so stupid!
The game is split into stages or waves, and if you don't clear a wave fast enough, these pterodactyls will come out and try to kill you. The pterodactyls themselves can be killed, but you have to hit them in a very specific pixel-perfect way, so it's probably best to just avoid them. Joust is a pretty classic, albeit often forgotten arcade title. The 5200 port itself seems pretty good. There are 4 difficulties: Novice, Skilled, Advanced, and Expert. It also has the cooperative 2-player mode, so it's complete for the most part. The physics seem like they translated well and all, but this controller does not do it justice at all. The problem is that this joystick is supposed to have this linear acceleration, where the harder you tilt it, the stronger it registers that direction. It works really well in games like Missile Command, where you're basically controlling a cursor. The problem is, because of the way this thing is designed, the rate of tilt doesn't always equate to the same strength, so it's hard to build the muscle memory you need to replicate certain actions. So like, when you're walking the bird across a platform, sometimes you need him to walk slowly, sometimes you need it to run, and you never really know how hard you need to tilt the stick to translate to the right speed, and so sometimes you run when you want to walk, sometimes he doesn't move at all until you tilt the stick further than you thought, which results in a delay reaction, and this controller is just not good at all. So this stick really was kind of the first attempt at what you typically see now in an Xbox or a PlayStation controller, but it was just way ahead of its time and it shows. I actually did find a couple of homebrew controllers that have been made somewhat recently that I guess fixes these issues, but I just didn't want to spend the money and I really wanted to go through these games in their original glory with this horrible controller. But the game itself, I'm not gonna lie, it's one of the more fun experiences I had going through this stack. I remember when I did this for the Big 20, hitting that 100,000 mark was a challenge for a lot of people. I think the 5200 port is more challenging, but I also think that this controller is a big part of that challenge. But I kinda got into it and really wanted to hit that 100,000 mark. I find it most effective to just float in one space and lower yourself onto the birds as they pass by, rather than fly across the screen really fast trying to hit them. When we did this on NES for Big 20, we would hover by the spawn points and try to bop the birds as they came up, but I just found that to not be very feasible because of how imprecise this controller is. It's just hard to make small adjustments to get into the right spot. After a while of playing, I did manage to hit that 100,000 mark on the 3rd try using the Novice difficulty. Later on in that same run, I actually managed to hit 200,000, then later I managed to hit 300,000, I actually played that single game for about 35 minutes and wound up hitting a whopping 350,000 points. It was pretty insane. Like, I was really locked in and kind of wondered if it would ever end, because the difficulty didn't really seem to be increasing that much. So yeah, I gotta give this one an A. Really solid title, lots of fun, it's an A. Alright, so on to Vanguard. This is yet another one I never played until I started working on this video. I don't really have much to say about this game. It's pretty cool, I guess. It's a side-scrolling space shooter kind of thing. So you get this E and it makes you invincible for a little while, and that gives you this nifty little tune that would have driven my parents absolutely crazy. There's a lot of options on startup. You can do 1 or 2 players, you can do single shot or rapid fire. I'm not 100% sure why you wouldn't just do rapid fire. I mean, I notice you can't move as fast when you have rapid fire on, which presents challenges, but you know. You not only have a stage select, but you can pick which section of each stage you want to start on. So it looks like there's 4 tunnels, 1st through 3rd and a novice. Each has like a collection of zones. One thing I liked is that there are these boss fights, which I guess are pretty cool. I don't know, fun game, I'll give it a C. Next up we have Defender. So I did have this one growing up. It wasn't one of my favorites, but it was fun once I figured out what I'm supposed to do. Dude, I was 4, give me a break. So Defender is a pretty classic side-scroller shmup. You basically fly back and forth through this tunnel, shooting these invaders out of the sky while they try to come to the bottom, grab your little people, and take them off to wherever. So you have a little map radar thing so you know which way to go to rescue your people. You also get like 3 bombs that'll clear the screen that you're on, which is pretty cool. It's a cool concept, and this is actually a pretty cool port of it, I guess. I kind of don't like how uncontrollable the ship is. It's like you can turn around and scroll either way, but every time you turn around, because of the way the screen scrolls and the way the enemies move, it's just really kind of confusing. So I find it's best to just fly in one direction. Like, the tunnel makes a loop anyway, so there's really not a lot of reason to turn around. Like, I get what they're going for, and if they put you in the middle of the screen, it'd probably work a lot better, but because it positions you close to the edge, it plays more like an auto-scroller like Vanguard or Gradius, where pressing aft makes your ship fly backwards instead of doing this turning around business, causing the screen to recalibrate and the player to kind of lose their bearings. But flaws aside, I do like Defender, so I'll give it a B. Why not? Alright, next up is Dig Dug. So this game's cool. I'm not too familiar with it. We didn't own it back in the day, and I didn't play it too much in the arcades, so before this video I knew of Dig Dug, but I never really got into it that much. I mean, it's fun, I guess. You dig these little paths and then try to kill enemies by attaching your little hose thing to them and filling them up with air until they burst. It's kind of weird, honestly. It reminds me of Cabal's fatality in Mortal Kombat 3. You can do 1 or 2 players and there's a stage select, but it just seems like it's the same level over and over again, and it kind of feels repetitive until it gets old. So I don't know. Something about this game gives me the impression that they could have done a lot more with it. Like, I'm not sure what, but the game itself seems like a missed opportunity in a way, because the digging is actually really cool. But I don't know. It's fun for a minute or two, but I'm not really overly attached to it or anything. I'll give it a C+. I'll give it a C+. Next in the stack, we have Countermeasure. So you wouldn't think it to look at it, but this game is actually really cool. We had this one when I was a kid, and it has kind of a learning curve, but once you get it down, it's actually really fun. It's basically a top-down tank game. You're trying to gather pieces of a password that you use to disarm a nuclear warhead before the timer runs out. The overworld controls are a little wonky, but if you're a fan of games like Iron Tank on the NES, you'll love this one. You get the pieces of the code at these little barrel-looking things, and once you're ready, you go to this rocket thing to try to disarm the weapon. So the actual code is 3 digits, and there are only 3 letters possible for each digit for a total of 27 different combinations.
It's multiplication.
You don't really need to collect every piece of the code, so if you wanted to, you could just head straight for the disarm station and guess the password. I usually just get 1 or 2 pieces and then head straight for the silo and guess at it. Of course, each part of the combination you have, the exponentially easier the code is to guess. If you disarm the device, you get this nice peaceful scene. If you fail to disarm the device, you get this skull and crossbones screen, which when I was a kid thought was the coolest thing ever.
Oh, it's the music?
But yeah, I really do like this game. Let's give it a B. I mean, it's not as much fun as Joust or whatever, so we'll give it a B. B for butter my biscuits. Okay, so next up is a personal favorite of mine, Frogger. The cartridge is weird. Why does it look like this? And spoiler alert, we're gonna go ahead and put this in S tier, and I'll tell you why. Frogger, specifically this port of Frogger, is my favorite single video game of all time. I've said it over and over again. People who follow me closely on Twitch know how much I love this game. And I don't even really know what it is. Just something about it is just so much fun. The plot is pretty simple. Get 5 frogs across the stage and into the little slots at the top. It's basically Crossy Road before Crossy Road was Crossy Road. And you know what? How dare Crossy Road? You ain't Frogger. You ain't nowhere near as cool as Frogger. How dare you insist upon yourself like that?
It insists upon itself.
What does that even mean?
But yeah, you can collect these little pink frogs for extra points, and you can try to get your frog into the little slot that has the fly at the top of it. One thing I will say about this port that's kind of funky is that there is a jump button, so you use the stick to point the frog in the direction you want to go, but then you have to press one of the orange buttons to make him jump. This is contrary to the arcade version where he just jumps in the direction you point. But still, it's such a classic game and I really do love this port.
No, I didn't go that way. See if I can try it.
I mean, come on, they made a Seinfeld episode around this game.
Perfect combination of Mountain Dew and mozzarella. Just the right amount of grease on the joystick.
And the funny part about it is that I never owned this game as a kid. My cousins owned it, and I used to love to go to their house and play Frogger. Like, I just love this game. I'm not gonna say it's the greatest video game of all time, but it's my favorite. And since this board is all subjective and meaningless, it's going up there, S tier. Alright, so we're almost at the bottom. The last 2 are good ones. So this one is Missile Command. So you basically control this little missile launcher designed to blow these lines and triangles out of the sky in order to protect your 6 cities on the ground. When a line hits one of your cities, you lose that city. You can gain cities back if you get enough points, and it makes this cool little noise when you do. I like when you clear a level and then it makes the sound that. But if you run out of cities, then it's game over. So as you get up in levels, the color palette changes, kind of like Centipede. And I really like getting far into the game and seeing all the different colors. Some of the screens, though, are just blinding. Like, it goes from kind of dark to just bright-ass baby blue. Like, what?
Oh, that's so bright.
The gameplay is really cool because you're controlling this little cursor. And I have to say, it's really good execution on the whole linear acceleration thing. I mean, it's about as close as you can expect this thing to get to emulating a mouse in a way. And I just think it's a really cool concept. I'm kind of surprised we didn't see a lot more games like this pop up over the years, but I guess it's okay. I mean, you don't really have a lot of riff-raff pop-up games to sort of dilute the whole concept. Missile Command is a classic and was one of my favorites growing up, so I'm giving it an A, right? That makes sense? A. And finally, we have one of the greatest video games of all time, Miss Pac-Man. So I love Miss Pac-Man as a character. In fact, she's the only tattoo that I have. But like I said earlier, I had the regular Pac-Man growing up on 5200, so I have honestly not played this specific port very much. It seems to be a lot more true to the arcade than Pac-Man is. Like, it has the vertical portrait layout, it has the right colored ghost, it does make some concessions on graphics and sound, but that's pretty much expected on any arcade port, really, especially from this generation. It has the same stage select feature that the original Pac-Man has in the 1 and 2 player modes, and this one actually also has the teddy bear stage, which I think is like a super easy stage to kind of give you a head start. But like, the early stages feel really clunky, and I think that's just a product of the way they're trying to emulate slower speeds, kind of. Like, once you get on in levels, it's great, and it flows really well, but the early stages are just so clunky feeling for some reason. You know what, I'm gonna put this down as a B. Like, you might disagree with that, and I will say that Miss Pac-Man as a franchise is a lot better than that. And the game is pretty complete when you compare it to the arcade version. In fact, I would totally agree that Miss Pac-Man is better in the arcade than standard Pac-Man. I honestly had a really hard time justifying why I would rank Pac-Man above this, which is why I went back and re-recorded this part in post. But in going back and playing both, something about the 5200 port of Miss Pac-Man just feels a little clunky. I can't really explain it, but the regular Pac-Man just feels so much better to play. It could just be nostalgia talking, but something about the look and feel and sounds of the original Pac-Man on this console just really hits home for me. So yeah, Miss Pac-Man's gonna get a B, and people can just disagree. Also, why is there a green ghost on this label, and there's no green ghost in the game? Okay, so that's it. That's my entire 5200 library. I noticed I didn't put any of these games in the F tier, but I mean, none of these are bad games. I mean, that's not to say there aren't bad games on the 5200, and a couple of these games are kind of meh. But, I mean, none of them are bad. The 5200 was kind of the Wii U of the 80s. Like, they're both fun and they both have a small library of great games, but they also both ride the heels of consoles that were massive successes at the time. And even though I think both of them are superior to their respective predecessors, it's hard to sell people on a new console that's a modest upgrade to one that was such a huge revolutionary success in the market. But I love the 5200, it was my first console, and it will always have a special place for me. I've never played the 7800 though. I've always been curious about it. I've heard it compared to the NES as far as hardware is concerned, but I just don't know too much about it. So if you had any of these consoles, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the comparisons between them or whatever else. Please leave a comment. So that's it. Like and subscribe. Thanks for watching. Follow me on my socials and all that, and I'll see you guys on the flip. Bye! But no, when I was a kid, my family had the less popular but far superior Atari 2600. Wait, damn it. Also, the double and cavity modes give you a double-decker pattern instead of just the single. Also, the double and the cavity modes give you a double-decker pattern. Also, the double and cavity modes give you a double-decker paddle. Double-decker paddle. Also, the double and the cavity modes give you a double-decker paddle. Okay. Also, the double and the cavity modes give you a double-decker paddle as opposed to the one. Okay.